This isn't any ordinary podcast. For a start, we have a selection of tea that other podcasts could only dream of. Going for peppermint today. We've got chamomile, Barry's, Lions, you name it, we have it. Secondly, it's out in nature, in the fresh air, not in some stuffy podcast studio. Got the Mrs. Rowe cup. And thirdly, there's no hyper editing or fancy cuts. It's real, it's raw. Welcome to Ciorcal Conversations. Ciorcal Conversations has been in the works for quite a while now. Not the actual name itself, but the idea to bring real and unfiltered conversation to you, the listener. Over the coming weeks, months, hopefully years, I'll be bringing conversations, topics, subjects, people to you that really interest me, and for you to be a fly on the wall on these conversations. This is episode 1, a solo episode to talk you through who I am, what the podcast is for, and then every second week I'll have a guest podcast where I'll set up shop somewhere out in nature and see where the conversation takes us. There's no script, there's no pre-planned questions. It's just a flow of conversation, and I'm so looking forward to it. On the other weeks, I'll be doing a solo podcast where I speak about things that I'm interested in and make you a part of the conversation. Things I'm working through, things I'm struggling with, things I'm fascinated by. And ultimately, this podcast is a way for you and I to follow curiosity, to see where conversation takes us, to bring a more vulnerable conversation to this space, because I think it's what people are looking for. In a world that's becoming more disconnected from authentic expression, it's lovely to be able to sit down and talk from the heart, something I'm coming back to and something I'm really excited to share with you. The purpose of this podcast isn't to gain 1 million followers or knock Joe Rogan off his perch. It's to bring real and honest conversation to you, helping you reconnect to yourself in a world that feels like it's becoming more disconnected. And I guess it makes sense to begin with a little bit about who I am and why all of this stuff is important to me. If you're new to the page or to my social media, my name is Owen. I'm 29. I'm from Mayo and I'm a breathwork facilitator, but I still can't fully believe I'm saying that, because there's a part of me that doesn't really know how I've ended up here, but then there's also like a deeper part that feels like he is exactly where he's supposed to be right now. Literally sitting in this wood, Barna Woods, which if you've been here before, you'll know what a cool place this is. There's been a lot of things happening in my life, particularly over the last couple of months, that just feel like they're meant to be. And that's a weird thing to kind of explain. But maybe it's best to rewind a good bit to the start of, I guess, my story, which feels centered around my teens. If you've been following me for a while, you may have seen me speak about my inability to express emotion when I was younger. I said in a post around my why that I know what it's like to move through the world thinking that you need to earn your worth. And that was very much me along the way, my experience to the point where I am now, the people pleaser, terrified of rejection, trying to always say the right thing, to do the right thing, not to stand too tall above the crowd. And it cost me quite a bit. It cost me deeper connection with others. It cost me a general level of enjoyment and happiness in my life. And I felt very disconnected from myself. And when I speak about disconnection to me comes from the neck down, from emotion, from happiness, joy, excitement, and also the emotions that are harder to be with, which is probably where the disconnection comes from. I wasn't really willing to feel my feelings. I just spent all of my time in my head, like ruminating, overthinking. I remember learning what the word anxiety meant when I was around 18, and it put words on something that I had felt for years but could never really explain before. And yeah, it was just a general theme throughout my teens, was not really understanding myself, which is quite common, but that carried into my 20s, and it made life very difficult to navigate for those years, which are like very formative years. One of my big issues was that I never felt comfortable sharing how I was actually feeling. I didn't really have the language for it. And even when I started to develop the language for it, I found it very difficult to express openly and also feel what was going on in my body. And yeah, like I said, it cost me very much along the way. In terms of how life flowed, I used to play a lot of sport when I was younger, but as I got older, through into my late teens, more and more tension started to build in my body. And at the time, I just presumed it was to do with like playing sport and getting injured, and I get like soft tissue massages and it would help a little bit. But as I got into my early 20s, my body started to seize up more and more, and no physios, or I went to a chiropractor, I went to specialists, could really explain it. And it's only now looking back that I realize where all of this tension was coming from, and it was the tension that's created when you don't feel safe to express. If we think about emotion as energy in motion, if you don't express that energy, to me it gets held in the body, and that's what was happening. There was all this energy wanting to be expressed, full expression of myself, but because I felt like I had to show up in certain ways for the people around me, which was all down to me, it was my perception of, I guess, my lack of safety in the world around me. All of this energy kept getting stuck in my body, and I get more and more tense. When I was sitting in school, I'd be hunched over, my shoulders would be high, my neck would be strained, my jaw would be tight. And over time, this builds and builds, and I got stiffer and stiffer. And if we think about it through the lens of disconnection from emotion, like not being able to fully express, that disconnection from emotion, it started to make my world feel very, very small, and it impacted my like friendships, it impacted my relationships, my ability to like enjoy what was happening around me. I did primary school teaching in university, and my mother is a teacher, my sisters both did teaching. I felt like at the time that it was a good fit for me, but when you're young, you don't really think too much about these things, and I didn't really think too much about those things, and I kind of just coasted through those years, became a teacher and taught for a couple of years, and I kind of enjoyed it. It was okay enough for me to stay with it. I didn't really question it too much. And then when COVID hit, I was in a part-time job teaching, so that work dried up and I was left with all of this free time. Was starting to get more into my fitness and ended up becoming a personal trainer. Now, when I say I was starting to get more into my fitness, looking back, it was driven by a lack of self-worth. If we come back to the people pleasing and wanting to keep everyone around me happy, it was because I was afraid of rejection. And getting into fitness was also a way to gain praise, to be validated by others because of the way I looked. And I went down that rabbit hole for quite a while. Now, you'll remember that the tension was building at the time. So as I was trying to like build muscle and get in better shape, my body was becoming more and more tense also, with the pressure and the stress of trying to be a certain way in this world, and then also the physical tension that I was adding through gym as well. So it's a very weird one for me, because as I started to get in better shape, my body started to shut down that little bit more and more in terms of like closing in on itself. And it got to the point where I had qualified as a PT and I was in really good shape and I was getting validated for that, and I was putting pictures of myself up tensing online, and that felt good at the time. And all of this was just hiding deep insecurities, I guess, but I didn't see this at the time. When the schools opened back up, I ended up teaching as well as personal training for a couple of years. And it started to add more and more stress to my life. So I was obviously quite busy because I was working 2 jobs. But then the pressure that came with, in my mind, needing to look a certain way as a personal trainer who was working in person and online, and then also trying to help people to look a certain way as well, when the only reason I did that in the first place was because of a complete lack of self-worth that didn't change when I got in shape. I thought that getting in shape would make me feel worthy, feel happy, and it was a short-term fix. But once I got there, I didn't really feel any different. The same insecurities were there. And if anything, they nearly got worse because I thought that this thing that would fix me would be the answer, and it wasn't. And that opened a very different can of worms around body image, and it led me to a pretty dark place, to be honest, one that I couldn't open up about. And it took a friend of mine when I was living in Dublin teaching, asking me like, what's going on with you? I can't remember his words exactly, but he was the first person I opened up to about how I was struggling with my mental health. And at the time, primary school teachers had access to mental health services, and I did one session with a therapist online, and it was my first introduction to breathwork, which I'd actually forgotten about until recently. And we did this like flower breath where we would breathe in and imagine the flower getting wider, and we'd breathe out and imagine the flower getting smaller. And I remember at the time it gave me some relief, but there was a lot more going on underneath the surface around self-image, people-pleasing, fear of rejection, not knowing who I was in this world. And I was younger at the time, so it makes sense. Like, young adult struggling with all these things kind of adds up, but when that's your world, it feels like it's closing in around you. And I moved to Australia in 2022 as a way to escape how I was feeling. Spoiler alert, it made everything so much worse because there was a certain amount of safety in the way that I was living in my earlier 20s. I had the structure of school, I was playing sport, which I kept getting injured from. My body was just shutting down on me. I had the safety of family and friends around me, and it finally started to open up even just a little bit, which did help. And then I moved to Sydney in November 2022, and all of those like safety nets just like broke down around me, and I ended up in like a really dark place around that time. 4 weeks after I got to Australia, I paid 10 grand for a hip surgery to fix a recurring groin injury that I thought would get me back to full fitness and I could live this Aussie healthy outdoor lifestyle, which in my PT days was all that I ever wanted. And 6 weeks into that rehab, my back gave out, and it put me on a really like winding road of discovery over the course of 2 years. Kind of the catalyst was the surgery. That the surgery itself was successful, but my body just wasn't able for the rehabilitation. And that first year I really struggled because I was in this place where it was everything that I thought it could be in terms of exercise and social life and lots of young people my age. But I felt so disconnected from that because of how I was feeling internally, and was afraid to actually face the emotion that was lying under the surface. So I kept distracting from it. I'd stay busier with work. I was teaching over there, still working for myself as a PT. And I just kept burying the emotion until about a year in, it just got too much. I had left my job in teaching and decided to work for myself full time as a personal trainer because my ego was telling me that that was something I'd be validated for and loved for by others. If others saw me working for myself, and especially as a PT and in Australia, that people would accept me for that. But all that did was make me harder on myself. And for anyone who works for themselves, running your own business is incredibly stressful, not to mention if you're struggling with all these tendencies around people pleasing and social media being a really toxic place for you because you're looking for validation, for likes. And that just drove my body deeper into tension. I'd remember like I'd be doing 10, 12-hour days on my laptop and sitting like this, wondering why I was so tense. And I'd do like 30 minutes in the gym, thinking that would undo the tension, like some stretching, etc. But if you think about it, 30 minutes doing one thing, 10 hours doing something else, that was only ever going to end one way. And I remember at the time I go to different physios and they give me stretches and exercises and they wouldn't help. And at the time I blamed the exercises. Like, you try and find reasons for these things. The rational overthinking mind will try and find reasons. But looking back, it was me. Like, I was so dysregulated and in fight or flight. So moving between fight or flight, which is that mobilizing, activating energy, and just complete shutdown, which is like a numbness, apathy, no feeling at all. I would shift between these states, and I did that for like 14 months until I just couldn't really keep doing it anymore. I moved to Melbourne for my second year in Australia, and long story short, it got to a point where I was so burnt out and definitely like symptoms of depression. I was really reluctant to call it depression at the time, but looking back, a lot of the symptoms were there and recurring for like longer than a couple of months, which is one of the key, I guess, diagnostics with depression. And it just, yeah, my body just basically went into shutdown. I had zero energy, zero lust for life. My sex drive was on the ground. It was just such a difficult time, but an important time because it pushed me into going deeper to find answers. I was actually working with David Gray Rehab at the time, who were helping me rehab my physical injuries. And about 6 weeks in, it got to a point where my body was in so much pain from the emotional dysregulation, the nervous system dysfunction, that my back ended up giving out. And I voiced this on a call, and the next day I was contacted to say that maybe this wasn't the right fit for me, which really upset me because it at the time felt like the only thing that even could potentially help me in some way. And we managed to smooth it over at that point, and continued working together on the physical stuff, with also the addition of adding in some nasal breathing. And to me, this was like completely new at the time. I didn't even know what nasal breathing was. But the reason it was added in was a way to down-regulate the nervous system. Because the thinking behind it was we had done 2 months of trying to rehab the physical stuff and it wasn't really working. We need to change something else. And the idea being that if my body was in constant fight or flight, in a state of stress, none of the physical work that I would do would make any difference because I wasn't able to recover from it. So alongside going to therapy at that time, which was amazing as like a top-down approach. So we worked with my thoughts and reframing my mindset. If we think about cognitive behavioral therapy, it's our thoughts influence our feelings influence our actions, and then our actions influence our outcomes. So that was a way of working with how I was feeling from the top down. And then working with the breath was a way to come bottom up. So also changing how I was feeling in my body, my nervous system, to influence the thoughts that I had, to then influence my actions, and then influence the outcome or the outcomes that came from those actions. And through a blend of those, but particularly the breath work, the bottom up stuff, which was so new to me at that time, I slowly started to see green shoots coming. And at the time, the ego that was like own personal trainer, own working online, digital nomad lifestyle, I booked a trip to Bali in June of 2024 to work online from there, enjoy myself. And when I got there, I tried to work for like 2 days, and at this point I was starting to listen to my body, and my body just said no, like you are not able for this, through the form of like intense pain and tension all up in my neck and shoulders. And it sounds cliche, but that trip was really transformative for me, for the simple reason that it forced me to stop pushing myself so hard. Up until that point, I thought the way to grow and to progress was driving harder with work, driving harder with the gym, being more productive, more effective, this like self-help mindset. And what that trip taught me was that there is so much value in actually doing nothing, in slowing down enough to listen to what your body is trying to tell you. There's a phrase in the military that slow is smooth and smooth is fast. Up until that time in my life, I did not understand that. I couldn't get my head around the idea that I would have to slow down to actually come back to myself and to speed things up again. And that was like the first green shoot in my journey. It was also my first real introduction to breathwork. Really simple nasal breathing, 5 seconds in through the nose, 5 seconds out through the nose. I did that for 10 minutes every day in the morning and 10 minutes every evening for a month straight. And bit by bit, I started to come back to regulation, like back into the green. And it wasn't perfect, and I still struggled a lot after that for the rest of 2024, but it was, like I said, a green shoot into what this could be for me. I made the decision to move back to Ireland towards the end of 2024. And the same as moving to Australia back in 2022, that brought up a world of shit for me in terms of like needing to face up to patterns and problems in my life that I was still continuing to push down, because I'd found a way to regulate my nervous system in real time, but hadn't gone any deeper than that in terms of understanding who I was underneath all of the expectations that I had put on myself and ways of being in the world, the people pleasing, the fear of rejection, the need for others to like me. I hadn't really dealt with any of that, and without really knowing what breathwork was at the time, like I'd done this little bit of nasal breathing, I was on the bus home from Dublin Airport at the start of December in 2024, severely jet lagged, and Pat Dively, a breathwork facilitator from here in Galway, his course popped up on my Instagram feed, and it was called Journey to Breath, and I went into it. And I've told this story to a few people, but maybe not on my page before. I signed up for a breathwork facilitator training, not wanting to become a breathwork facilitator. The reason I signed up for that course was because the first 2 months of the 6-month course were all about personal process. So actually looking at ourselves before we even touch on what it means to be a breathwork facilitator. 300-hour course, so a really intense course. First 2 months were all about ourselves, with the idea being that to be able to hold space for others through breathwork, you need to be able to hold space for yourself. So month 1 was around the hero's journey, which is like a map for transformation. Nervous system regulation was a big part of month 1. And then month 2 was all around shadow work. And without going too deep into shadow work involves meeting the parts of ourselves that we find difficult to be with or to love. So some might say the darker parts of ourselves, the parts that we find hard to show to the world around us because maybe they're too much, or we'll be judged for them or criticized for them. Because ultimately, as we move through our worlds, we're constantly scanning for ways to stay in connection with others, and we will change how we show up to receive that love and connection from others, even if it means it's at the expense of who we are underneath that. And that was a big part of my disconnection, because the more we put on these masks to stay in connection with others, the more we lose connection with ourselves. And that was a huge pattern for me throughout my teens, throughout my 20s, the people pleaser, wanting everyone to like me. And I knew that I needed to get to the bottom of that, but I didn't know how. And when I looked at this course and looked at that shadow work element in particular, Pat is a shadow worker himself. He wrote a book about it as well, which is an incredible read. It's called Shadow Work, and you should check it out. When I saw that as part of the training, I was like, this is going to be difficult, first and foremost. It's not easy work, but this is the change that I need to actually understand who I am in my core. And also moving home, I knew I needed something to focus on and to anchor to. Plus, I was really struggling with the personal training at the time, because there was this disconnect between me wanting to work with people to help them go a little bit deeper, but the people coming to me looking for only the physical change. And I really value that as part of our overall health, like changing how you look physically. But to me, it's never been the full picture. And I used to find that really difficult, because when I'd be speaking to clients, I'd want to know like how their day is going and what they're finding stressful in their lives. Whereas they were coming to me just to look a certain way, to change their body composition or to get fitter. And I always wanted to go deeper. And I guess that's partly what pulled me to this breathwork space. So back to that bus journey home to Mayo from Dublin, severely jet lagged. I paid for the course, and a day later, I was kind of starting to come back to myself a little bit more, and I looked at it and I was like, what the fuck have I just done here? Like, this is a huge mistake. I've signed up for something that physically I'm not able for, because my body was still very tense, holding on to a lot. And I was also moving home with the intention of building up the personal training business, because I didn't really know any different, and I wanted to make more money and give it a real go. So there was so much change happening in my life, not to mention fucking moving home from Australia, which is another podcast episode in itself. But there was so much change happening, and the day after I signed up, I messaged Pat and was like, look, I actually don't think I can do this. My body isn't physically able for it. I don't even know if am I in the right headspace. And a couple of days later, we jumped on a call, and over the course of an hour and 20 minutes, he didn't try and like sell me the course. We just had a really open and vulnerable conversation. And at the end of it, he just said that he thinks that this would be a really big help for me. And I'm so glad that we came to that conclusion, because within 2 months of starting that course, I was a completely different person. And it wasn't an easy process. It wasn't an easy transformation. Working with shadow, working with nervous system regulation, it shines a light on a lot of difficult parts of yourself that are hard to be with. But ultimately, it's that journey inwards that adds meaning and richness, fullness to our lives. By month 2, the green shoots were starting to appear. By month 4, I was like, okay, this is what I want to do with my life. I have found something that I am so passionate about, that I just love being in. I love the conversations. I love the breath work. I love the depth of it. By month 5, I had a business plan for Ciorcal fully developed, and I hadn't even finished the course yet. And then by month 6, which was August 2025, when I graduated, I was just so ready to hit the ground running with this. Like, there was so much fear there, because stepping out of the unknown, out of something that has safety in it into something new is incredibly scary. But I'm really thankful for the regulation piece, like to be able to have this tool at my disposal. The breath to help regulate was so important for me in navigating the stress and the fear that came with changing direction. And what essentially happened over the course of 2025 is I started taking on less and less people for personal training, not because I didn't feel like I could help them, but because I was making space for something new that was coming. And I had some incredible coaching experiences in 2025 with the clients that I worked with, incredible changes to their bodies, incredible physical feats, like people running marathons and really pushing their limits. And whilst I enjoyed that so much, I just kept feeling this quiet pull towards breathwork more and more, to the point that within a couple of months of starting to work as a breathwork facilitator, I made the decision to park all of the personal training stuff and move deeper into being a full-time breathwork facilitator. And alongside this was Ciorcal. Ciorcal is a space for deeper, authentic connection to self and others through breathwork, coaching and community. And since I've launched it on the 1st of September, it's changing and growing momentum so rapidly. Like, over the course of last year, my following on social media doubled. And it was all because of conversations like this, me just turning on a camera and speaking more openly, vulnerably and honestly about the things that I was finding difficult. And I'll touch on it more in a couple of minutes, but there's so much power in that, because it helps us to feel like we're not alone. And in a world that's becoming more insular, where we're spending more time by ourselves, we're exposed to more social media content than ever before. All of this stuff pushes us inwards. And not inwards in a good way, in the way that I speak about coming inwards to meet what lies underneath. I mean inwards in terms of making our world feel very small, disconnecting us from genuine connections with other people. And that was where ciorcal originated from. The idea came from, if anyone has been here for over a year, the run, walk and talk events that I organised in Claremorris in 2025, which were a way to bring people together through exercise. Because when I moved home from Australia and I was working solely online, I was so lonely just sitting in my playroom all the time. And a little bit selfishly, I wanted to create space to connect with others. So long story short, over the course of 3 events, we had 200 people come down to Clare Lake. And for anyone who's listening that was there, I still think about that so often. Those days meant so much to me, because it taught me the value of actually meeting people in person and getting out of the online space for a while and getting out into nature, which is partly why I'm here right now, because it adds so much to my life. And I know for a fact that everyone who came to those came away feeling the same way. And that's where ciorcal came from. Me wanting to create more spaces like that, to build community where you can be seen as you are, not who you think you need to be, which ties into a lot of the work I did on myself last year about coming back to myself. Breathwork is an incredibly powerful tool to come inwards, because if we think about the body as being the unconscious and the mind as the conscious, breathwork allows us to come into the unconscious and uncover insights that have been held in the body about who we are beneath all of the overthinking, all of the rumination. That's a podcast in itself, which will be coming in time, all of the ins and outs around breathwork. But to take you back to ciorcal and that September launch, within a couple of weeks, there were 45 people on the first free online breathwork facilitation, which just blew my mind that people were, 1, interested in breathwork, and 2, willing to come along and to see what ciorcal was all about. And since then, building up the breathwork side of things has been amazing, and I love the work that I do with people, but equally building the ciorcal community, which now includes offline social circles here in Galway, out in Barna and Sulala Space, group breathwork facilitations. We're heading up Diamond Hill at the end of this month for our first outdoor event. I can't wait for the summer in Galway, because the weather's going to be a lot drier and a lot warmer, to do sea swims, to do breathwork by the beach, to just take advantage of what it means to actually come together. And like I said, in a world that feels like it's becoming more disconnected, authentic connection is going to become even more important. And that, I guess, ties in nicely to ciorcal.conversations, which is this podcast. This is a space for you to tune into depth of conversation, where there's no specific topic. It's just about seeing where the conversation takes us, and for essentially you to feel like you're another seat here, and that you're part of conversations like this, because the world needs more of them. In a world that's becoming more and more sanitized, and people are less likely to open up because they feel like they'll be judged or rejected if they're seen in their full selves, it is so important for conversations like this to happen, to normalize actually speaking your truth, saying how you feel, feeling safe enough to express. Because ultimately, I say this phrase a lot on my social media and I absolutely love it. Your outer world will always be a reflection of your inner world. And what I mean by that is, if you don't feel safe to express how you're feeling, the things that are happening for you, that you continue to keep everything in, your outer world will start to feel very small. That's been my experience anyways. The more I repressed emotion, for example, if I was angry about something and didn't express a boundary, or if I was sad about something but I wasn't able to open up about it, or if I felt shame around part of my appearance and I didn't feel safe to open up to a friend or family member about that, I am closing off that part of myself, that expression. And the more I shut off from my internal world, the smaller my external world feels. Because if I don't feel safe to express around people, I can't connect with them in deeper ways. And I have experienced like deep loneliness in my life, not from having no people around me, because I'm so lucky to have a very supportive family and a friend group from home and friends that I've met on my travels and in the different places that I've lived. But I didn't allow those people to see me fully. And that has felt like a very lonely place. And I contrast that with how I'm coming to you now, full of expression, full of energy, full of the joys of life, because I've come back to myself, who I am beneath all of that conditioning and ways that I thought that I needed to be in this world. And to be able to sit here in front of a camera and have a conversation with you, I guess is a sign of how far that I've come in myself. And I'm kind of thinking about this in real time, that yeah, I'm really proud of myself to be able to sit here and speak like from the heart and speak vulnerably about the difficulties that I've experienced and that how I've come through those, which is probably the most important part. Because I think when we're feeling quite low and struggling, the first piece is it's very hard to open up about that, but also there's a fear there that it might never change. And I definitely felt that, especially in my early 20s. I used to look at the people around me thinking, if they only knew how I was feeling inside and this like dark cloud that was following me around. And I never thought that it would lift. Genuinely, there were a lot of days where I was like, oh, this is just the way life is going to be for the rest of my days. And I am so glad that I wasn't willing to let that be my reality. And that even though things were really difficult, I eventually found the words to open up, which was the first piece of the puzzle. And then another piece of the puzzle was actually starting to feel my feelings, because the more in touch I became with my emotions, the more in touch I became with expression of how I was feeling, expression of emotion through the breath, expression through movement, expression through creativity, expression through creating ciorcal, which now feels like, it's kind of weird to say, but it feels like my life work. I feel like I have very much found my purpose within the work that I do. Whew. And that's such a magical thing. And maybe that's what's waiting on the other side of getting to know yourself in deeper ways. Carl Jung says the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And I don't know if I'll ever get to that point, but fuck me, isn't it an exciting thing to follow my curiosity and be on that journey and see where it takes me, because life is too short. I'm so excited to continue sharing all things ciorcal with you through ciorcal conversations, through the ciorcal community. Yeah, this is the start of something really, really special. And it's so great for me to be able to take you along, I guess, on this journey, as opposed to just letting things be known when they're finished. Like, this is the first podcast and I have no idea where this is going to go from here. But what I do know is this gives me so much energy. Speaking to people, I've recorded a few of the conversations that will come in the next couple of weeks already, and they have been incredible. They have flowed. We go deep. There's laughter. They're just really special, and I can't wait to share them with you and share how this grows and grows along the way, because this is something that I'm going to be working on for the rest of my days. And like I said, I have no idea where it's going, but isn't that the beauty of it, that it can go in whatever direction that the wind takes me in? Right now, that is the one-to-one breathwork I do with my clients, the group breathwork, the ciorcal community events, and now Ciorcal Conversations, the podcast. I would really appreciate if you enjoyed this conversation, and if you would like to see more of these conversations over the coming weeks, months, years, to subscribe to the channel and maybe share some love in the comments, or share it with a friend. Yeah, share it with someone who you think might benefit from a space like this, conversations like these, spaces in terms of the Ciorcal community that you can be seen fully as you are, not who you think you need to be. That's my mission within Ciorcal, to create more spaces like that, to allow you to meet yourself in deeper ways, reconnect to self in the presence of others. And to me, this is only getting started. I feel like it's going to be such a big year for me personally and for Ciorcal. And yeah, I'm excited to share that journey with you. I'm going to leave it at this for now. Episode 2 is coming next Tuesday, and there'll be an episode released every Tuesday after that. Like I said, guest episode 1 week, solo episode the next week, guest episode, solo episode. And that's how we'll continue with Ciorcal Conversations into the future. Grow more, chat soon, Owen.